103 Amazing Facts About the Black Indian of the Western Hemisphere by Kanyon, a Non-Reservationist, and this is outlined. So I'm going to cover this book, all 103 facts, and this should be illuminating, and it might be troubling or challenging for some people. If you think you might be challenged, if you feel defensive already, then you should smudge yourself with Palo Santo or sage stick and ask the spirits to open your mind to accept, okay? I'm just going to read a little bit of the introduction. This work has been written in a special way to psychologically and spiritually heal the mental and spiritual damages that have been done to the Black, Indigenous native of the Western Hemisphere, so-called American Indian. It is also designed to make the Black, Indigenous native of the Western Hemisphere aware of the psychological and spiritual damages that have been done. It is not for everyone. It is an antidote for a degree of sickness that has been embedded deeply within the well-being of my people. My people have been programmed to think that Africa is their homeland when home is right under their feet. This work has repetitive tones to it for a reason. It is designed to deprogram the systematic programming of the Black, Indigenous native of the Western Hemisphere throughout the Americas on how they have been mentally trained since birth to view themselves and how they have been mentally trained since birth to view and perceive their own ancestors. My name is Kanyon. I was born and raised on the west side of Chicago. My father's side of the family comes from the Coweta, Kusuta, Shawnee, and Tuscarora people. My mother's side of the family comes from the Salagi, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Chula, people. Based upon the matriarchal society that was once honored by most of my people and still honored by some of us, I am Salagi. I come from a long line of women who trace their lineage through women. Whatever the woman's clan is, so is the child. However, the strongest spirit on me and the strongest ancestral spirits who walk with me is from my father's side. I am a red stick warrior. We opposed European expansion onto our ancestral lands. We opposed our own people who supported this and opposed our own people who supported the rebel government called America. We fought against Europeans' new rebel government, America, and our own people. We bathed in hot blood with our own kinsmen who were wooed and seduced by European lifestyle and European trinkets. Many battles were fought with the white man. Many more were fought with our own people who became victims of the white man's spell. Throughout different battles, where there were 1,000 or more white people on the battlefield, there were triple the number of us in ranks alongside of them, helping them with their European colonialism campaign. Wow. As a child growing up during the 1970s at the age of 5, my grandparents took me back to where they were born and raised, which is Minter City and Money, Mississippi in LaFleur County. They took me to various burial grounds and showed me where my ancestors were resting. In my family, no known relatives still speak our native tongue. It comes out during spirit possession now. My family has maintained rich information about our lineage, yet many members of my family are victims of European colonialism. They don't talk about the old ones anymore like they did when I was a child. The names of our ancestral clans are not even spoken anymore. The only thing that matters to them now is going to the white man's schools, receiving his indoctrination and stamp of approval, graduating, getting a job, and paying your bills on time. When I was a child, I often heard the elders in my family say that I had been here before. They said that I was old and that I would one day become a preacher. As a child, I always saw spirits and they always saw me. I was the only child for 9 years. During that time, most of my time was spent communing with the spirits. I loved the colonized God called Jesus as a child. I was so passionately drawn to his story. I read the Bible from front to end constantly. I memorized the books of the Bible, the ones that weren't taken out, always listened to Christian preachers on the radio and would write them letters. My grandmother went to church seldomly. On some Sundays, when I wasn't going to church with her, other Sundays I was honoring the Hindu god Krishna with my mother at the Hindu temple on the north side of Chicago. As a child, I sat on the lap of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. I did not know that one day this would be something very special. I remember as a child on the west side of Chicago, white people called my family the N-word while riding by in their car. When I said my prayers to Jesus at bedtime, I wondered if he would call me the N-word when I got to heaven, since he looked just like the other white people who called us the N-word. Sometimes saying my prayers at bedtime was often confusing as well. Should I pray to Jesus tonight, or should I pray to his Father God tonight? Should I pray to God tonight, or will I pray to Jesus tonight? Will God get mad if I give Jesus too much attention, or will Jesus get mad if I give God too much attention? When I got older, I learned that Jesus was really dark skinned, or what some might say black. I learned that his hair was woolly and that he looked nothing like the program image that was still instilled in me. I also learned that there were many achievements and great accomplishments that had been done by so-called black people that was never recorded in my school textbooks. I also learned later why, as a child, the kids teased me when I told them I was Indian. I did not fit the programmed image that was instilled into most people. They did not know, like most adults today, that we all do not look like Sitting Bull or Geronimo. When I got older, I learned that the titles Negro, Colored, and Black does not represent a nationality. I learned that in the not so distant past, any dark skin or brown skinned person, be they indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, Africa, Asia, or Europe, were called Negro or colored by those who were melanin recessive so-called white people. I learned that millions of my people, the darker natives, were relabeled as Negro and colored, and again relabeled as Black Americans by pale-skinned Europeans. I learned that the titles Negro, colored, Latino, Hispanic, Black American, and African American were colonized titles, intentionally placed upon my people to condition them into thinking that we all come from Africa, Spain, or anywhere else other than being indigenous to these shores. Many of my people who did not maintain their true tribal identity became victims of being psychologically, spiritually, and geographically removed from their native land and placed on a continent 2,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, Africa. Does this sound like you or your friends? Tell you one thing, sounds like my family. Let's get into the outlines. Okay. 1. Black Indians have lived in the Western Hemisphere since time immemorial. Black Indians were not spawned or created as a result of Africans coming to the Western Hemisphere during the transatlantic slave trade, mixing in with native people of the Western Hemisphere region, also known as Native American Indians. 3. Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, also known as Indians, did not refer to themselves or their ancestors as Indian. We use the word Indian since most people are accustomed to this title. The word Indian, Red Man, and Native American are European colonized terms. Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere refer to themselves by way of tones, vibrations of expression. Your spirit said who and what you were. The name given to you is based upon what type of spirit you possessed. And that is true. This is me talking. The chief of my tribe gave me a name, and I was shocked because the name reflected my spirit. Anyway, number 4. All native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, possess different physiological features. Hair texture, bone structure, and skin tone varied. Number 5. All native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, did not and do not have high cheekbones, slanted eyes, reddish copper skin, or straight black hair. Number 6. All native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere did not live in teepees and pueblos. Number 7. It is difficult for society to accept the Black Indian as being native or indigenous to the Western Hemisphere region because society has been brainwashed with fabricated fake images of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Number 8. Most reservation Indians were carefully selected by the U.S. government to occupy reservations when reservations were being established. Number 9. The U.S. government, for the most part, selected pale-skinned Indians or Hollywood version Indians to occupy U.S. government-established reservations. Number 10. The U.S. government selected a certain physiological type of native, aka Indian, to promote to the world as this is a real Indian as well as this is how a real Indian looks. Remember the crying Indian, Iron Eyes Cody? He's Italian. Number 11, the dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were reclassified during the 17 and 1800s as Negroes and coloreds. Hey, guess what? Walter Plecker did that, and we're going to go through that soon. Okay. Number 12, certain dark-skinned natives were allowed to settle on reservations with pale-skinned natives. Most were not. Number 13, pale-skinned natives came about as a result of the original dark-skinned natives breeding with pale-skinned Europeans. A light-skinned native born from this union would again breed with a pale-skinned European, thus the progeny of this union would become more pale or genetically recessive. After centuries of this breeding process eventually produced the pale-skinned native of the Western Hemisphere. The dark-skinned natives who did not mix their seed still endure. The U.S. government has reclassified most as Black Americans or African Americans. Yes. Number 14. Certain dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were given an ultimatum. Go to Oklahoma and be an Indian on the reservation, or stay where you're at and be reclassified as a Negro or colored. Gotta tell you right now, I have quite a few Cherokee ancestors, and they had to go through the Trail of Tears. Ended up in Oklahoma. Did you get that far in your family tree building? Did you find ancestors who had to go through the Trail of Tears? Let me know. Let's start a conversation. Number 15, most dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, who were reclassified as Negro or colored during the 17 and 1800s, have found themselves in the 20th and 21st century again reclassified as Black Americans and African Americans. Yes, yes, and yes to that. Number 16, dark-skinned natives indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, who embraced the Spanish culture during the colonial era, either by choice or by force, have found themselves engulfed or assimilated into Spanish culture and the Spanish language. Now, most of them have lost the knowledge of themselves and their true identity. They too have been reclassified as Latino or Hispanic. Number 17. All native people or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, spoke different dialects of a language synonymous to the Hebrew language. Number 18. Most early European writers during the 1400s throughout the 1800s, including pale-skinned Jews, all agreed that the heathen savage of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, throughout the Americas were without a doubt descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Number 19. A pale-skinned European by the name of James Adair, an English writer and trader during the 18th century, lived amongst Black Indians in the Southeast. James Adair wrote a book entitled History of the American Indian. In his book, he claimed that the Indians of the Western Hemisphere were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. And I gotta say, Kurameo Ahau did a video on James Adair, and he was not pale skinned, he was dark skinned. Anyway, number 20. James Adair, in his book, History of the American Indian, wrote 23 arguments to support his findings that the so-called American Indians were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Number 21. Nat Turner, Paul Coffey, Crispus Attucks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Harriet Tubman, Denmark Vesey, Elijah Poole, aka the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, amongst millions of others, were indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Number 22. The titles Black American and African American are fake, inappropriate European colonized titles to keep indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, under a spell of ignorance. And we have Jesse Jackson to thank for that. Number 23. The titles Black American and African American were purposely created to psychologically and spiritually disconnect indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, from their true motherland, which is right up under their feet. Number 24. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, a South Carolina Cherokee, started and promoted the fake title of African American that has been imposed upon Black Indians indigenous to the Western Hemisphere region. Yep. Number 25, it has become quite profitable to brainwash the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, into thinking that Africa is their native land. As much as I love Black Panther, I love seeing brown people on screen. Wakanda is not African. Wakanda is an indigenous term. Has nothing to do with Africa. Anyway, 26. There is a campaign currently underway by the U.S. government and U.S. government-sponsored natives that preaches a doctrine that says that the Black Indian of the Western Hemisphere is a result of African mixture and has not always dwelled in the Western Hemisphere. If you do your genealogy, and I don't mean DNA, I mean actual paperwork, 8 times out of 10, you will find either you had an indigenous ancestor, or 2, or 3, or 4, heck, all of them, or indigenous and European. Seriously, do your paper genealogy. 27. Most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans, when asked if any Native Americans are in their family, at least 95% respond with the answer yes. In addition to this, most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans are also able to give you the name of the tribe that their relative comes from. Thus, the so-called Black American or African American oddly insist upon calling themselves Black American or African American, instead of referring to themselves by way of the ancestral tribal name that has survived in their family, which in essence is their true nationality. Growing up, my older brother used to say, "Hey, we're Cherokee," and I thought nothing of it. My stepfather, one day, after I had mentioned to him, "Hey, Mom's face is really round and it's flat." And he said to me, "Yeah, that's the Indian in her." I just shrugged and went on playing hopscotch. Didn't know. Okay. Number 28. Most so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans find it difficult to accept themselves as being Native or indigenous to the Western Hemisphere because of programmed, fabricated images of Native people in the Western Hemisphere. Fake images of their own indigenous ancestors has been routinely drilled into their psyche since birth. The Black Indian image does not register within their psyche because of the fake imagery programming that the U.S. government has instilled into their minds of how Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere look. The spirit of so-called Black Americans or so-called African Americans tells them one thing, while the programmed fake image of their own ancestors says another. This all leads to inner conflict. Yes, and yes, and yes. Number 29. The U.S. school system and the media have been the two biggest giants behind programming into the masses fake fabricated images of Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Number 30. Native or indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, built pyramids and pyramid mounds just like the ancient Egyptians. This synonymous comparison of both cultures from opposite sides of the world is because they both were genetically linked. They both are the same people. Anyone have an ancestor who was buried in Cahokia or uh, Nikwazi? I have an ancestor who's buried in one of the mounds. Okay, number 31. During the time of Pangea, a Greek word that means all one, all the continents on the planet were one mass of land. People lived and thrived during the time of Pangea. This is a large explanation as to why pyramid builders in the Eastern Hemisphere and pyramid builders in the Western Hemisphere have cultures that are incredibly synonymous. The continents continue to move. Some move 4 inches a year. The continents will one day become one mass of land again. The continents are currently separated at this time. However, the genetic link of beings from Pangea never parted. Number 32. The term Moor was applied to dark-skinned, brown-skinned, and reddish-brown-skinned people who are not only indigenous to Europe but to West and North Africans. Even Black Indians of the Western Hemisphere were also dubbed with this title. Number 33. Indigenous Black Celtics, Indigenous Black Britons, Indigenous Black Portuguese, and Indigenous Black Spaniards, all also known as Moors, had a long time knowledge of indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere. These Moors were well informed of the different customs, traditions, and languages of the natives of the Western Hemisphere. These dark-skinned Europeans, Moors, were used as buffers by pale-skinned Europeans to help colonize the New World. These indigenous Black Europeans, aka Moors, not only solicited the New World to pale-skinned Europeans, but also waged war on indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians. Do you have so-called Moors in your family? You might have some healing to do with the ancestors on that. Number 34. Certain Black indigenous Europeans, aka Moors, that went under such titles as clergymen and European nobility shared a common consciousness with pale-skinned Europeans. That common consciousness being that the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, aka Indians, were untamed heathen savages. Number 35. Both dark-skinned and pale-skinned Europeans who are either Celtic, Briton, Gaelic, or what have you, who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe and were struggling to preserve ancient traditional customs dubbed pagan ways, upon arrival to the New World ran to the bosom of Black Indian nations indigenous to the Western Hemisphere soil, who still held on to and were practicing traditional spirituality. Both cultures were different, however, both were able to relate to each other as gods. Black Indian nations and different clans native to Europe both shared a common spirituality that centered around the forces of nature and the honoring of the ancestral spirits. Number 36. Certain Moors helped to navigate Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. He wasn't lost. He knew exactly where he was going, simply because of who was on the boat with him. Yes. Number 37. The U.S. constitutional government is a plagiarized copy of a Black Indian governmental system, the Iroquois Nation. Yes and yes. Number 38. The founding fathers did not find anything. They went to Black Indians, the Iroquois Nation, seeking assistance to break away from their chief back in England, King George III. The Iroquois Nation taught them their system of government. The only part that the so-called founding fathers left out was the matriarchy. Black Indian women ruled the Iroquois Nation. Yes. I'm Algonquian and Iroquois, among others. Most Black Indians of the Western Hemisphere found themselves seduced by European lifestyles, customs, and traditions. Number 40. When the American Revolutionary War broke out, Black Indians found themselves fighting against their own kinsmen. Some Black Indian nations sided with the British, while other Black Indian nations sided with the colonial rebels, aka Americans. Number 41. After Black Indian nations helped to set up the colonial government, America, and in addition to helped to sponsor military support for the new colonial government, Black Indian nations continue to fight and war amongst themselves as they did before and after Europeans set foot upon Western Hemisphere shores. Number 42. Black Indians were not conquered by Europeans or the so-called white man. Black Indians had a rich history of intertribal warfare amongst each other that continued before and after European arrival. The intertribal warfare that existed amongst Black Indians in the Western Hemisphere was so great that it left them in a state of impotency, with impotency setting in after years and years of clan warfare, in addition to the attraction of European trinkets, customs, and traditions, and the worshiping of the god named Jesus, all assisted in paving the way for European occupancy of Black Indian lands, their spirits, and their minds. Number 43. After the colonial government was established, America, Black Indian nations continued to aid the new colonial government with military assistance on other Black Indian nations that fought against European expansion and the taking of their ancestral lands. I gotta take a moment to drink some water. This is a lot. Okay. Number 44. General Mad Anthony Wayne, aka the Black Snake, was a Black Indian who served under the George Washington administration. The army of General Anthony Wayne consisted mostly of Black Indians in the ranks, as did the entire colonial government army. Besides Black Indians making up the bulk of the new colonial government army, American, Moors also filled up the ranks. Number 45. George Washington established treaties or contracts with various Black Indian nations, as well as the Moors, for military support against other Black Indian nations who did not support the occupancy of the new colonial government, America. By the way, Kirameo Ahau did a video on the swarthy George Washington. Check it out. After the colonial government, America, confiscated most Black Indian lands, the colonial government, refused to pay Black Indian warriors pensions for their military support. Number 47. During the American Civil War, Black Indians joined the Confederate Army in hopes of winning to secure what little ancestral lands they had left. Number 48. Other Black Indians joined the Union side of the American Civil War to fight for their own objectives as well. One of those objectives being seeking prosperity within the American system. Number 49. Nickajack, also known as, and I'm not saying that word, was a black Chickamauga, a black Indian. This ancestor led raids against the colonial rebel army Americans during the colonial rebel uprising American Revolutionary War. He fought alongside of the British Tories. His hideout was a cave in the vicinity of what is now known as Chattanooga, Tennessee. In the state of Georgia, in the region known as Cobb County, there is a park, a road, and a creek named after this great warrior. Number 50. There were thousands upon thousands of black Indians who fought in the American Civil War and in wars before and after this war who were black Indians or native to the Western Hemisphere region, but were oblivious to this fact. They only thought themselves to be Negroes. Their parents and their parents' parents who had lost the knowledge of themselves, tribal identity, in all honesty, simply passed on to the next generation the colonized title of Negro to their children. Thus, an unbroken chain of ignorance continues to survive. Okay, I'm going to stop there before my jaw falls off. But this is a lot, and I'll check back for part 2. Okay? Telling you, do your paper genealogy, and no one will be able to tell you who you are once you know who you are. Okay? And your ancestors will be ever so happy that you're doing your genealogy, and they will help you if you ask. But if you continue to be something you are not because you don't or won't do your paper genealogy, I don't know. Anyway, tune in next time. Peace out.